The Saratoga Campaign in 1777 was an attempt by the British High Command for North America to gain military control of the strategically important Hudson River Valley during the American Revolutionary War. It ended in the surrender of the British Army, which historian Edmund Morgan argues was a great turning point of the war, because it won for Americans the foreign assistance which was the last element needed for victory. The primary thrust of the campaign was planned and initiated by General John Burgoyne, commanding a main force of some 8,000 men. He moved south in June from Quebec, boated up Lake Champlain to Middle New York, then marched over the Divide and down the Hudson Valley to Saratoga. He initially skirmished there with the Patriot defenders with mixed results. Then, after losses in the battles of Saratoga in September and October, his deteriorating position and ever-increasing size of the American army forced him to surrender his forces to the American General Horatio Gates. On October 17, the elaborate plans drawn up in London all failed. Colonel Barry Street, Ledger, was assigned to move on Albany, New York east through the Mohawk River Valley, but was forced to retreat during the siege of Fort Stanwix after losing his Indian allies. The major expedition from the south never materialized due to miscommunication with London when General William Howe sent his army to take Philadelphia rather than sending it up the Hudson River to coordinate with Burgoyne. A last-minute effort to reinforce Burgoyne from New York City was made in early October, but it was too little, too late. The American victory was an enormous morale boost to the fledgling nation. More important, it convinced France to enter the war in alliance with the United States, openly providing money, soldiers, and munitions, as well fighting a naval war worldwide against Britain. British strategy. Toward the end of 1776 it was apparent to many in England that pacification of New England was very difficult due to the high concentration of patriots, and so London decided to isolate New England and concentrate on the central and southern regions where loyalists supposedly could be rallied. In December 1776, General John Burgoyne met with Lord Jermyn, the British Secretary of State for the colonies and the government official responsible for managing the war, to set strategy for 1777. There were two main armies in North America to work with: General Guy Carleton's army in Quebec and General William Howe's army, which had driven George Washington's army from New York City in the New York Campaign. Howe's plan to attack Philadelphia. On November 30, 1776, Howe, the British commander-in-chief in North America, wrote to Jermyn outlining an ambitious plan for the 1777 campaign. Howe said that if Jermyn sent him substantial reinforcements, he could launch multiple offensives, including sending 10,000 men up the Hudson River to take Albany, New York. Then, in the autumn, Howe could move south and capture the U.S. capital of Philadelphia. Howe soon changed his mind after writing this letter. The reinforcements might not arrive, and the retreat of the Continental Army over the winter of 1776–77 made Philadelphia an increasingly vulnerable target. Therefore, Howe decided that he would make the capture of Philadelphia the primary object of the 1777 campaign. Howe sent Jermyn this revised plan, which Jermyn received on February 23, 1777. Burgoyne's plan to capture Albany. Burgoyne, seeking to command a major force, proposed to isolate New England by an invasion from Quebec into New York. This had already been attempted by General Carleton in 1776, although he had stopped short of a full-scale invasion due to the lateness of the season. Carleton was heavily criticized in London for not taking advantage of the American retreat from Quebec, and he was also intensely disliked by Jermyn. This, combined with rival Henry Clinton's failed attempt to capture Charleston, South Carolina, placed Burgoyne in a good position to get command of the 1777 Northern Campaign. Burgoyne presented a written plan to Lord German on February 28, 1777. German approved it and gave Burgoyne command of the main expedition. Burgoyne's invasion plan from Quebec had two components. He would lead the main force of about 8,000 men south from Montreal along Lake Champlain and the Hudson River Valley, while a second column of about 2,000 men would move from Lake Ontario east down the Mohawk River Valley in a strategic diversion. Both expeditions would converge upon Albany, where they would link up with troops from Howe's army marching up the Hudson. Control of the Lake Champlain-Lake George-Hudson River route from Canada to New York City would cut off New England from the rest of the American colonies. The last part of Burgoyne's proposal, the advance by Howe up the Hudson from New York City, proved to be the most controversial part of the campaign. German approved Burgoyne's plan after having received Howe's letter detailing his proposed offensive against Philadelphia. Whether German told Burgoyne, who was still in London at the time, about Howe's revised plans is unclear. While some sources claim he did, others state that Burgoyne was not notified of the changes until the campaign was well underway. Historian Robert Getchim believes that Burgoyne would probably have been aware of the problems that lay ahead had he been notified of the Philadelphia plan. Whether German, Howe, and Burgoyne had the same expectations about the degree to which Howe was supposed to support the invasion from Quebec is also unclear. What is clear is that German either left his generals with too much latitude, or without a clearly defined overall strategy. In March 1777, German had approved of Howe's Philadelphia expedition and did not include any express orders for Howe to go to Albany. Yet German also sent Howe a copy of his instructions to Carleton, which plainly stated that the Northern Army was to make a junction with Howe's army at Albany. In a letter from German to Howe dated May 18, 1777, he made clear that the Philadelphia expedition should be executed in time for you to cooperate with the army ordered to proceed from Canada, and put itself under your command. This last letter, however, was not received by Howe until after he had departed New York for the Chesapeake. To attack Philadelphia, Howe could either have moved overland through New Jersey or by sea via the Delaware Bay. Both options would have kept him a position to aid Burgoyne if necessary. The final route he took, through the Chesapeake Bay, was immensely time-consuming and left him wholly unable to assist Burgoyne as German had envisioned. The decision was so difficult to understand that Howe's more hostile critics accused him of deliberate treachery. Burgoyne returned to Quebec on May 6, 1777, bearing a letter from Lord German which introduced the plan but lacked some details. This produced another of the conflicts of command that plagued the British throughout the war. Lieutenant General Burgoyne technically outranked Major General Carleton, but Carleton was still the governor of Quebec. Germain's instructions to Burgoyne and Carleton had specifically limited Carleton's role to operations in Quebec. This slight against Carleton, combined with Carleton's failure to get command of the expedition, led to his resignation later in 1777, and to his refusal to supply troops from the Quebec regiments to garrison the forts at Crown Point and Ticonderoga after they were captured. American strategy. George Washington, whose army was encamped at Morristown, New Jersey, and the American military command did not have a good picture of British plans for 1777. The principal question on the minds of Washington and his generals Horatio Gates and Philip Schuyler, who both were at turns responsible for the Continental Army's Northern Department and its defense of the Hudson River, was of the movements of Howe's army in New York. They had no significant knowledge of what was being planned for the British forces in Quebec. In spite of Burgoyne's complaints that everyone in Montreal knew what he was planning, the three generals disagreed on what Burgoyne's most likely movement was, and Congress also rendered the opinion that Burgoyne's army was likely to move to New York by sea, partly as a result of this indecision and the fact that it would be isolated from its supply lines if Howe moved north. The garrisons at Fort Ticonderoga and elsewhere in the Mohawk and Hudson valleys were not significantly increased. Schuyler took the measure in April 1777 of sending a large regiment under Colonel Peter Gansevoort to rehabilitate Fort Stanwix in the upper Mohawk Valley as a step in defending against British movements in that area. Washington also ordered 4 regiments to be held at Peekskill, New York, that could be directed either to the north or the south in response to British movements. American troops were allocated throughout New York Theater in June 1777. About 1,500 troops were in outposts along the Mohawk River. About 3,000 troops were in the Hudson River Highlands under the command of General Israel Putnam, and Schuyler commanded about 4,000 troops. International interest. Ever since the 7 Years' War, France's foreign ministers, beginning with Choiseul, had followed the general idea that the independence of Britain's North American colonies would be good for France and bad for Britain, and furthermore that French attempts to recover parts of New France would be detrimental to that cause. When war broke out in 1775, the Comte de Vergennes, then the foreign minister, outlined a series of proposals that led to secret French and also Spanish support of Congress, and some preparations for the possibility of war, including expansion of the navies. Vergennes did not think open participation in the war was diplomatically or politically feasible until Washington's army demonstrated its strength and ability to gain military victories without significant assistance. To further the aim of French participation in the war, Vergennes closely monitored news from North America and London, and worked to remove impediments to Spanish participation in the war. Vergennes went so far as to propose war to King Louis XVI in August 1776, but news of Howe's capture of New York City scuttled that plan. Campaign begins. Most of Burgoyne's army had arrived in Quebec in the spring of 1776, and participated in the routing of Continental Army troops from the province. In addition to British regulars, the troops in Quebec included several regiments from the German principalities of Hesse and Brunswick under the command of Baron Friedrich Adolf Friedesel. Of these regular forces, 200 British regulars and 300 to 400 Germans were assigned to St. Leger's Mohawk Valley expedition, and about 3,500 men remained in Quebec to protect the province. The remaining forces were assigned to Burgoyne for the campaign to Albany. The regular forces were supposed to be augmented by as many as 2,000 militia raised in Quebec by June. Carleton had managed to raise only 3 small companies. Burgoyne had also expected as many as 1,000 Indians to support the expedition. About 500 joined between Montreal and Crown Point. Burgoyne's army was beset by transport difficulties before it left Quebec, something that apparently neither Burgoyne nor Carleton anticipated. As the expedition expected to travel mainly over water, there were few wagons, horses, and other draft animals available to move the large amount of equipment and supplies on the land portions of the route. Only in early June did Carleton issue orders to procure carts sufficient to move the army. Consequently, the carts were poorly constructed of green wood, and the teams were driven by civilians who were at a higher risk of desertion. On June 13, 1777, Burgoyne and Carleton reviewed the assembled forces at St. John's on the Richelieu River, just north of Lake Champlain, and Burgoyne was ceremonially given command. In addition to 5 sailing ships built the previous year, a 6th had been built and 3 had been captured after the Battle of Valcour Island. These provided some transport as well as military cover for the large fleet of transport boats that moved the army south on the lake. The army that Burgoyne launched the next day had about 7,000 regulars and over 130 artillery pieces ranging from light mortars to 24-pound pieces. His regulars were organized into an advance force under Brigadier General Simon Fraser, and 2 divisions. Major General William Phillips led the 3,900 British regulars on the right, while Baron Riedessel's 3,100 Brunswickers and Hanauers held the left. His regular troops started out in good condition, but some, notably some of the German dragoons, were poorly equipped for wilderness fighting. Colonel St. Ledger's expedition was also assembled by mid-June. His force, a mixed company of British regulars, Loyalists, Hessians, and Rangers from the Indian Department, numbering about 750 men, left Lachine, near Montreal, on June 23. Ticonderoga Falls. Burgoyne's army traveled up the lake and occupied the undefended Fort Crown Point by June 30. The screening activities of Burgoyne's Indian support were highly effective at keeping the Americans from learning the details of his movements. General Arthur Street Clare, who had been left in command of Fort Ticonderoga and its surrounding defenses with a garrison of about 3,000 regulars and militia, had no idea on July 1 of the full strength of Burgoyne's army, large elements of which were then just 4 miles away. St. Clair had been ordered by General Schuyler to hold out as long as possible, and had planned 2 avenues of retreat. Open skirmishing began on the outer defense works of Ticonderoga on July 2. By July 4, most of the American garrison was either at Fort Ticonderoga and nearby Mount Independence. The extensive fortifications on the Vermont side of the lake, unknown to the Americans. Their withdrawal from an outer defensive position cleared a way for the British to place artillery on the hilltop known then as Sugarloaf, whose heights commanded the fort. St. Clair withdrew the night after spotting British cannon on Sugarloaf on July 5, and Burgoyne's men occupied the main fortification and the positions on Mount Independence on July 6. The uncontested surrender of the supposedly impregnable fort caused a public and political uproar. Although a later investigation cleared both Schuyler and St. Clair of any wrongdoing in the withdrawal, it caused the Continental Congress to replace Schuyler with General Horatio Gates as commander of the Northern Department of the Continental Army. In August, Burgoyne sent forces out from his main body to pursue the retreating army, which St. Clair had sent south via 2 different routes. The British caught up with elements of the retreating Americans at least 3 times. General Fraser and elements of Baron Riedessel's troops faced determined resistance in Battle of Hubbardton on July 7, and a skirmish that same day between the vanguard of the main army met Pierce-Long's retreating companies in a skirmish at Skensborough. These were followed by another standoff in the Battle of Fort Anne on July 8, in which a forward company of the British Army was nearly decimated. These actions cost the Americans about 50% more casualties than those incurred by the British, and they demonstrated to the British officers present that the Americans were capable of putting up stiff resistance. Burgoyne's army was reduced by about 1,500 men as a result of the Ticonderoga actions. He left 400 men to garrison the magazine at Crown Point and another 900 to defend Ticonderoga, and the battles that followed resulted in about 200 casualties. The bulk of St. Clair's army retreated through the New Hampshire grants. St. Clair issued appeals to the states for militia support, and also arranged to have as much of the area's livestock and supplies delivered to Fort Edward on the Hudson River, where the American armies would regroup. St. Clair reached Fort Edward on July 12 after 5 days of grueling marches. Some of the remnants that had been scattered at Hubbardton rejoined the army, but Seth Warner and the remains of his regiment were stationed at Manchester in the grants. Reaction and delay. Burgoyne settled into the house of Loyalist Phillips Keene at Scansborough while the pieces of his army regrouped and he considered his next steps. He penned letters describing the British victory, intended for public consumption. When this news reached the capitals of Europe, King George was happy, and the Comte de Vergennes was not, as the news effectively scuttled an early proposal for French entry into the war. British diplomats increased pressure on the French and Spanish, demanding that they close the ports to American shipping. While this demand was refused, it markedly increased the tensions between the powers. The news was also harshly received by Congress and the American public, including slanders that St. Clair and Schuyler had been bribed. On July 10, Burgoyne issued orders for the next series of movements. Most of the army was to take the rough road from Scansborough to Fort Edward via Fort Anne, while the heavy artillery was to be transported down Lake George to Fort Edward. Reeder's troops were sent back up the road toward Castleton, primarily as a diversion intended to suggest that he might be aiming for the Connecticut River. Burgoyne's decision to move the army overland via Fort Anne was a curious one, for it contradicted his own earlier commentaries on planning the expedition, in which he presciently observed that defenders could easily block the route. His decision appears to have been motivated by two factors, the first being the perception that moving the army over water via Lake George would require a retrograde movement that could be perceived as a retreat, and the second being the influence of Phillips Keene, whose property would benefit by the improved road Burgoyne would have to build. General Schuyler, at Albany when he received word of Ticonderoga's fall, immediately rode to Fort Edward, where there was a garrison of about 700 regulars and 1,400 militia. He decided to make Burgoyne's passage as difficult as possible, using the axe as a weapon, as it was much easier to fell large trees in the enemy's path than to remove them after they were down. This brought Burgoyne's advance to a crawl, tiring his troops and forcing them to use up supplies. On July 11, Burgoyne wrote to Lord Sherman, complaining that the Americans were systematically felling trees, destroying bridges, and damming streams along the road to Fort Edward. Schuyler also employed scorched earth tactics to deny the British access to local provisions. In spite of Burgoyne's lack of movement, his scouts were active. Some of Schuyler's workers were attacked. Schuyler's tactics required Burgoyne to build a road through the wilderness for his guns and troops, a task that took about 2 weeks. They moved out of Scansborough on July 24 and reached Fort Edward on July 29, finding that Schuyler had already abandoned it, in a retreat that ended at Stillwater, New York. Before he left Scansborough, Burgoyne was joined by about 500 Indians from the Great Lakes region under the leadership of St. Luc de la Corne and Charles Michel de Langlade. St. Leger's expedition. Lieutenant Colonel St. Leger sailed up the St. Lawrence and crossed Lake Ontario to arrive at Oswego without incident. He had about 300 regulars, supported by 650 Canadian and Loyalist militia, and they were joined by 1,000 Indians led by John Butler and the Iroquois war chiefs Joseph Brant, Saw-Yincarator and Corn Planter. Leaving Oswego on July 25, they marched to Fort Stanwix on the Mohawk River, and began besieging it on August 2. About 800 members of the Tryon County Militia and their Indian allies marched to relieve the siege, but some of St. Ledger's British and Indians ambushed them on August 6 at the bloody Battle of Oriskany. While the Americans held the field of battle, they retreated because of the heavy casualties they suffered, including the mortal wounding of the leader, General Nicholas Herkimer. Warriors from Iroquois nations fought on both sides of the battle, marking the beginning of a civil war within the Six Nations. During the Oriskany action, the besieged Americans staged a sortie from Fort Stanwix and raided the nearly empty Indian camp. Combined with the significant Indian casualties at Oriskany, this was a significant blow to Indian morale. On August 10, Benedict Arnold left Stillwater, New York for Fort Stanwix with 800 men of the Continental Army from Schuyler's Northern Department. He expected to recruit members of the Tryon County Militia when he arrived at Fort Dayton on August 21. Arnold could only raise about 100 militia, as most of the militiamen that had been at Oriskany were not interested in joining, so he instead resorted to subterfuge. He staged the escape of a Loyalist captive, who convinced St. Ledger that Arnold was coming with a much larger force than he actually had. On this news, Joseph Brant and the rest of St. Ledger's Indians withdrew. They took most of his remaining supplies with them, and St. Ledger was forced to raise the siege and head back through Oswego to Quebec. Arnold sent a detachment a short way after them, and turned the rest of his force east to rejoin the American forces at Saratoga. St. Ledger's remaining men eventually arrived at Fort Ticonderoga on September 27. Their arrival was too late to effectively support Burgoyne, whose army was already being hemmed in by the growing American forces around him.